Well, I think we're going to get started now. So welcome to day 2 of MRDC Software Week. And today we are focusing on the data analysis section. It's going to be mainly presented by Phil Hearn and myself doing questions with him at the end of the session. You'll see on your screen there's a Q&A box. So if at any point during the presentation, if you'd like to pop your question in there, we'll do our best to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So I will pass over to Phil to begin the presentation now.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte, for that introduction. As Charlotte said, we're going to be talking about data analysis today, and a few things to say. First of all, that this is the second day of our MRDC Software Week, in which we're covering a different topic each day. Today's topic is data analysis. Yesterday we looked at data collection. We're moving on to data reporting tomorrow. Communities, online communities, and social media research on Thursday. And then we have a panel discussion with experts on Friday. And today's webinar is going to be looking at data analysis, mainly tabulations. And we're looking at, if we can here, some areas where we think we can help with you being able to look at the decisions that will help your business so that you can do your data analysis more efficiently, a lower cost, and choosing the right software to do that. It really isn't a sales presentation today. If you've tuned into this webinar to get a sales presentation of our tabulation software, we'd love to do it sometime, but that's really not the goal. It really is to open up a discussion where we can look at things that are important, we think, that you should consider, to offer some ideas on how you can improve what you do. And really, I'd like to open it up even further to make it a call, if you like, to improve the standard of software we have in market research. Market research software has grown from what it was perhaps in the 1990s to just tabulation software, and then CATI software came along, and it's now moved along in that time. But I still think it's got a lot of room for growth and improvement, and I really think that, the more research agencies demand of companies like us and others to get software in the right form so it makes their whole processes efficient, it means that the market research industry as a whole can compete with other industries that are close or related to market research. So what we're including in this, we're going to be looking at people who are doing cross-tabulations, producing summary results, perhaps some basic charts, extracting their data for other purposes, perhaps trying to get some automation in place where they've got perhaps a tracking study or a particular type of survey where they automate analysis. So looking at all those sorts of things. We're not today looking at reporting and dashboards, which some people might consider as analysis. They're covered separately in a webinar we're holding tomorrow, and we'll obviously be pleased to see you at that webinar. So in the lead up to these series of webinars this week, we conducted a survey amongst people working in market research agencies, and we got some interesting feedback, and we broke down the feedback by the different topics that we're covering this week. And of course today's is data analysis, and we were actually quite pleased to find there weren't a lot of problems encountered. Where they were quite specific, and so we've actually had to just sort of take a little bit of poetic license and add it into that feedback we get talking to people who consider buying software to try and get a fuller picture. And some people were pleased to say they had a low incidence of problems in their surveys. And I think that tended to be with people who do similar types of surveys, so they get good at handling a particular types of surveys. Where problems start to creep in, I think, are where you do a survey that's unusual to what you're used to. So you might conduct a lot of market research surveys, and then perhaps you handle a diary where you're collecting what people eat at every eating occasion throughout a day for 3 weeks. And now that sort of data is not quite like typical market research data where you ask a series of questions. You're asking the same questions a variable number of times each day and for a period of time, and so it's not what you might call, what I would call, flat data, in the sense that you're asking 50 questions or whatever it might be and getting 50 responses. You're asking a different number of questions or those amounts of data is being collected based on how many eating occasions there are and the length of the diary. So people start to have problems with those sorts of surveys, or of course surveys that are just very big, where processing time can take a long time. Now, software's a strange business. It's not like the way that humans work. And I say this perhaps slightly lightly, but where you have a piece of work that you're doing as a human, if you give that person twice as much of that work, it'll take them roughly twice as long. Now, I could accept that if they get bored with doing it, it might take more than twice as long, or if they're working against a tight deadline, they might be slightly quicker. But that won't be true with a computer that's processing a survey. I have known of software products where if you give it too many records with too many tables, it will not just take twice as long. So a survey that perhaps is on, let's say, 25,000 respondents with 500 tables, if you doubled any of those numbers, the number of tables or number of respondents, or you doubled both, it wouldn't necessarily just double up to 2 times or 4 times if both of those criteria were doubled. It wouldn't necessarily double up. It might take 10 times as long, or even I've known of software that suddenly gets overloaded and might take 50 times as long. So it's not a straight doubling up, and so people with big surveys sometimes find that they run aground when they're handling something that's a bit unlike what they've handled before. And finding the right tools to do the different types of analysis that you want can be difficult, and that's something that came out. I was interested to note that people are demanding more statistics. There was a comment that came out of the survey from a couple of people, and I think that's something that I've noticed as well, that more and more people are interested in significance tests and a variety of statistics that are needed. That carries over into multivariate analysis as well, where products like SPSS are quite good at doing multivariate work, but of course there's other tools that are better for doing tabulation work, such as our own. Real-time analysis is not available. I think that's something that's gradually changing and will be covered actually tomorrow in the reporting webinar, where we will be looking at analysis in that as well, but more in terms of online reporting. That'll be part of what we're covering tomorrow, and certainly real-time analysis is something I think is something that's growing in the industry. But we're going to consider today these issues, which I think tie in with some of the things that came out in the survey, and some of the problems. But who should produce analysis? There's different ways of working. Sometimes you have a team of people doing it, sometimes researchers do it, and I think there's some choices in there as to how you approach that. What's the best software to use, I think, is something that is an important question. And really making use of the skills that you have. Some companies have some highly technical people who are good at doing data analysis. Others have people who are better researchers and want the data ready to be able to delve into and investigate it for themselves. Others actually want a set of tables or reports ready so that they can just look at that and produce reports from that, or pass the data on in some other way to clients. And I think productivity is something I always like to focus on. Again, as I sort of mentioned there, in terms of computers generating things, if you double the task, it doesn't necessarily take twice as long. It might take 10 times as long. I think that's true in terms of productivity, where in terms of people who are handling complex surveys, they can easily take 10 times longer than they need to if they're not using the right software. And we'll look at something on that a little bit further in to the webinar. So there's powerful software, there's easy to use software out there, and we need to reflect on that. So let's look at some of the big DP issues. And I think one of the issues is that often senior management don't understand the impact of DP decisions. And I think that's not criticism of managers at all. It's just that getting into the detail of what takes time and what software is needed is quite a difficult task. And if there are senior managers on this webinar, I've seen them sometimes make decisions that I think are wrong decisions because they haven't consulted with the people on the ground. understanding what people do in DP is quite complex, and what takes their time is not something that's easy to explain. And sometimes DP people can't always explain that. They can't always explain. But I think it's a dialogue that needs to happen to improve the way you work. And I make this claim that boundary handle data processing can take 10 times longer, and I have known of situations where by rationalising the way a project is handled using the right software and the right people, you can actually, and I've got a project in my mind where the actual man hours spent on it was reduced to literally 3% of the time spent. So like 1 day a month, 1 man day a month rather than 30 man days a month. And so that's something I think that's quite important. I'm going to briefly touch on the working backwards technique to improve productivity, because I think it's something that can work quite well. And I want to look at an example of that, because I think we don't often see the barriers to there being a smooth operation. Now, I'm picking on one particular example here, but it's very easy that you have a tool that might collect data for you, so that you use that software tool, it produces some data, you then pass that data on to somebody whose job it is to perhaps produce tables. It might be the same person or the same team, but it might be another team altogether. Or you might have that data collected externally, and you start with the data, of course. And then, of course, there's a final requirement where that data is passed on as a report or as something that goes into somebody's database or some online system, whatever it might be. There's some destination for that data, and that's quite a sort of normal sort of throughput. And what I often find being a problem is that only at each step is it considered how difficult this process is. So the software used might churn out some data. That data might not be in a particular convenient form to put it into tabulations that we all want. And so a lot of time is spent in that bit in between, converting data so it can be analysed. And then the same might happen again when we convert that data to put it into maybe an online dashboard, or to deliver to a client in a certain way, or to get it into a PowerPoint report, something that most people do. That might not be very convenient either. And this just exacerbates itself when you've got things like a tracking study where you're doing it every month, and it's very easy for the researcher or the senior management or perhaps project controllers to think that the project should go easier and easier. And I'm thinking of tracking studies here particularly, though, or multi-country studies it's also true of, where most of the research process gets more and more efficient with the tracking study, that by the 3rd or 4th month it becomes all very smooth. The bit that doesn't work is the data processing bit, because data processing pick up all the problems and all the difficulties that go with it, and it doesn't get more efficient because either it's a laborious task to get the data into the tabulation software, or the tabulations into a form that can be put into PowerPoint, whatever it might be, or if there's errors, they pick up all the historical errors or all the changes in the questionnaire, which become difficult to perhaps manage in the tools that are being used. And so things like considering what tools you're using to handle a tracking study suddenly become very important. And I've seen people struggle and spend hours of their time converting data so that it works in a tracking study, for example, when minor questionnaire differences come into place. So we tend to think forwards, and we start with our software, our data, our table, whatever it might be in that process. I advocate thinking backwards, and the reason I say that is it makes you think what you're doing. So if that's the destination, that's the output that we have to give our client, whether it be a report or data in some format, let's worry about how we can get that in there efficiently. Well, it might mean we've got to produce a pile of tabulations so that we can get those figures into those reports. So let's think about what we need to get the tables in a form so that we can feed. So let's think backwards and see how we're going to get those figures for our reports. And it might not be cross tabulations, it might maybe some other system. Then let's look back. What do we need the data? What form do we need the data in to be able to do those tabulations, if that's the steps that we're going through? So think about it backwards. And finally, what tool will give us that data in a form that's convenient to work with. We might not want the data in an Excel spreadsheet. It might be a very inconvenient way to push it through to the further stages. So I think thinking backwards is always a good technique for getting a project efficient and working out what you want to do. I want to move on to looking at who should produce analysis. You might have a system in place already, but I don't think it's always questioned enough. And there's different ways of doing things. I know of companies who think researchers should do everything. They should do all the analysis themselves, produce their own tables, and so on. And I know other companies who think that specialist DP staff should do everything, and researchers should just get the results and then interpret that data and produce their reports or whatever else they're going to be doing with that data. And sometimes it's a mix of DP and staff. I think considering what works well is really important, and actually being flexible enough to vary that from project to project. I know of some companies where their DP staff just set up all the variables so that even the complex variables are ready for researchers to plug into and do whatever analysis they need. And that means that DP staff are doing all the sort of things that they're skilled at, which is manipulating data, handling data from data collection software, preparing complex variables that might need skills and learning of syntax or whatever else it might be. And then they're passing on to researchers those variables so that they can then just click and produce question 1 by some other complex variable or whatever it is they need for their reporting. So looking at that and being flexible with that and having the software so that you have that flexibility, I think can be really important. So that means you need tools that are good for specialist DP staff, tools that allow researchers to browse data and produce their own analysis, and it gives you that flexibility so that researchers aren't constrained, but DP staff aren't wasting their time guessing what researchers might want and producing more than they need, maybe. There's also further choices you can make. There's a big difference between somebody who's highly skilled in DP and somebody who's perhaps got a year's experience, and likewise with their salary bands, they tend to be significantly different. Somebody who's, I think, a highly skilled DP person can be highly valuable and rewarded with quite a high salary, whereas somebody who's just doing basic stuff can just be competent and good at their work, but wouldn't command necessarily a high salary. So it's important that the highly skilled people are doing highly skilled work, and I think it's very easy to get into a system. I've seen it with our software where we have highly skilled people doing data spec writing, where they're just actually typing in really easy bits of text and commands into a piece of software that anybody could do. Now, we want to avoid that. We don't want somebody who's highly skilled spending 90% of their time typing in maybe lists of code lists or brand lists and things like that. Anybody can do that with accuracy. And indeed, highly skilled people tend to be less accurate than people who are less skilled, as it happens. But you want your highly skilled people just doing the bits that are difficult. And I think having software that allows that is actually very important. Some software will only give you one way of doing things, and that's fine if you only do one type of survey, or your surveys are easy, or you don't have many surveys. But if you've got a whole range of surveys in place, you will want to have that flexibility, I think. Will training make a difference? Well, it will if you've got particular types of surveys that you're not familiar with. I know I've seen clients struggle to do types of surveys they are not familiar with. I talked about a diary study. If you're familiar with diary studies, they can be very easy to handle in the right software. In the wrong software, they can be difficult, but they can also be difficult to handle if you've not handled a diary study before in the right software. So understanding best techniques and best practices within some software can be really important, and getting that training. Productivity seriously matters, I think. I think it's something that is underestimated by management too often. it isn't uncommon for a skilled worker to be 10 times more effective than somebody who's using the wrong techniques. And I think this is something that is not often considered when costing projects sometimes, that you need the right people. I know one of their clients gave us a piece of work to do because they realised that for them to get the skills to do one particular project was just not worth it. It was cheaper to pass it on to us to do as experts in using our own software, and we produced it at the fraction of the cost they could have done because we knew how to handle that particular complex task. And I think doing a cost evaluation is sometimes something that we're reluctant to do. If we do, and I've made up some figures in this spreadsheet here, but I've said that example one, you could think that using skilled or less skilled staff and the right or inefficient software would make a difference, and sometimes it will and sometimes it won't. If we look at a sizable simple tabulation project, so let's say we've got a survey on 5,000 people, the number of respondents doesn't tend to matter much to people doing tabulations, but let's say although it's 5,000 sample and it's a long questionnaire, let's say it's an hour-long questionnaire, it might not matter if the tables are simple, whether someone's skilled or less skilled does it. And these are purely made up figures. I've said it takes a skilled person 2 days at $200 a day. That will obviously vary from country to country, so it's costing $400. A less skilled person might spend 3 days on it at $150 a day, and so the cost is negligible in terms of difference. And with the right software, it might make a difference between taking 2 days and 3 days as well. But the variables don't make much difference. The costs I've come out with there, and of course those figures are all fabricated, really show that it's not much difference. But then we come to something more complex where there's more volatility, like a tracking study or a diary or something, a multi-country study where there's differences in the questionnaire. And I don't think the figures below are particularly outrageous or being ramped up to prove a point. Let's say we've got somebody who's skilled. They might spend 5 days a month on the project at $200 a month, which works out at $12,000 a year, whereas a less skilled person might take twice as long, be cheaper, but ends up being quite a significant difference, $18,000 a year. And we look at that then with the right software. That person taking 5 days might reduce it to 3 days, let's say, and it could be even less than that. And that's $7,200 a year. With inefficient software, it still might be 10 days a month. It might be 15 days a month. You'll need to look at that, obviously, depending on your cost per day and your particular project. But you can see the sums of money start to get quite significant in the even on, I don't think this is an exaggerated example, the cost of handling this varies between $7,200 a year to $18,000. That's probably more than the cost of the software just on one project, and that's something that probably isn't considered enough, the cost benefit when it comes to tabulation software. And of course, these figures are fabricated, but they give you, I hope, some thoughts that how you can cost and look at your costs and whether you need and what type of software you need. I'm just going to spend a quick moment now on scripting languages versus GUI software. GUI stands for Graphical User Interface. They're big differences. You need to invest in training for scripting languages unless you've got somebody already skilled. Although I think someone can move from one scripting language to another fairly easily, that's not a problem. But if they're new to scripting languages, going to a scripting language having had no experience can be quite a big jump. And really the question you should ask yourself, are the users going to use the software every day or most days or just occasionally? Because if they're only going to use it, say, for 3 days every 2 months, a scripting language isn't typically the right tool unless they're doing something very specialist. What types of surveys where scripting makes a difference? I think it's tracking studies, multi-country studies, repetitive surveys where there's some repetition to them, perhaps with minor changes, and things where you've just got complex variables and analysis that you want. Long surveys don't mean you need a scripting language. I've seen people sort of think that because it's a long survey with lots and lots of tables that a scripting language will help. It might do, but it might not make us quite as much difference as those other types of surveys. But you do make less mistakes, or users will make less mistakes using a graphical user interface because there's less scope to go wrong. It might take them longer. It might mean a less skilled member of staff. It might mean lower salary costs. But there'll be less mistakes. So on that point, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to happy to take some questions. I've opened up some areas here, perhaps that I think will be things that you should be considering more in how you approach doing analysis. This will feed into tomorrow's webinar about reporting analysis, because I think actually reporting and online dashboards is something that's getting closer and closer to analysis as time goes on. And indeed, on our website, we're just actually changing that to put tabulations and reporting and online dashboards as one topic, because I think that whole delivery end is becoming more of a one than it was perhaps in the past, where we perhaps have done data collection, produced some tables, and then someone's done a PowerPoint report, and these are all independent parties, if you like, doing this part of the work. All right, I'm going to hand back to Charlotte now to see if there's any questions, and I'll hopefully answer them for you, and I'll come back at the end to just summarise. Thank you.
Great, well, thanks a lot for that, Phil. That was really interesting, and we have actually had some questions come in already. So I'll work through what we've got. But there's still a Q&A box on the screen now, so if anyone wants to add a question now, please feel free to. So the first one we've got here is it better to buy software that has tables and reported included all in one system?
I think that's a good question. I think the answer to that is, if you can find a piece of software that does everything you want in terms of tables and reporting, yes, it is better, because it saves the effort or the time that might be taken to move information or data from one system to another. The problem might come where you want a specialist tabulation software like our MRDCL, for example, that does complex tables and tracking studies and things like that, and you want to put that into a specialist reporting software tool, and you want the high or the top end products in each of those two areas. But of course, then it's important to check they connect well. So I think if you can find software that does everything in one package, yes, and does everything you need, definitely I would go for one. I mean, our Snap software, for example, does tables and reporting and meets most people's needs from that point of view. But it depends on the volume of work you're doing, the complexity of work you're doing, and the teams that you have, and so on. So yes, it's a good idea if it works, but if you need something better, you might need to look at specialist software.
Great, thanks a lot. We've got another one here. Does your crosstab software automate reports in PowerPoint or Excel?
Okay, so to answer that, we've got three bits of software that produce tables. We have QPS, MR, and MRDCL. Now, and also Snap, which I mentioned just now. Let's get one out of the way first. Snap's a sort of end-to-end system for online surveys right through to doing tables and reporting. If you want higher end stuff than that, or you want CATI, QPSMR is good for CATI and paper questionnaires, and does have tables in there. MRDCL and QPS, which use the same engine as it happens for doing tabulations, don't have any charting on the back of them within the software, but we recently released our MRDC reporting toolkit, which will take figures out of those two bits of software and automate the updating of Excel and PowerPoint reports. So that's something, if you're interested in, there's a blog article on that and a webinar on our website in the blog section, and obviously you can get more help from us. So we do have a tool that does that.
Thanks for that. We've got another one. I think researchers are better at producing analysis, and DP people are better at handling data. Do you agree with that?
I think it depends on the skills that you've got and the way you're organised. I think researchers are good at producing our analysis where it's within their ability to use the software to produce the results they need. On a complex study where there's perhaps complex weighting, hierarchical data, complex variables, you probably do need somebody who's a bit more expert to do the preparation of the tables and any figures that you want to put into reports. So I think it varies. I think some projects it works better on, some teams it works better with. I think you have to take a judgment on that. Certainly, I think DP staff are generally better at handling data. I agree with that half entirely of the question or the statement or the question. Because that's what they're used to doing, and they're good at building variables so that others can use those as for producing tables or calculations or figures in reports. But I think it will vary from team to team and company to company. But it's something I think that we're always happy to talk about. If anyone who's got problems in that area, it's something I like discussing with people, because I don't think there's one way to do things, and I think some companies do work in sort of quite old-fashioned, strict lines, and sometimes there's some need to rethink the way you work, and that's true across certainly all our products. I suspect other products that you might use as well.
All right, thanks, Phil. We've got one more come in here. It says, I read your blog article about QPSMR and MRDCL. Why would you need MRDCL when QPS can produce tables?
Okay, so there's another question about our products here. I'm not quite sure which blog article it was now, but I remember doing a blog article at some point that compared using QPSMR and MRDCL. I think it was at least a year ago, so I've forgotten most of it. But I think probably the difference is who's using the software. So MRDCL needs a skilled user. So if you haven't got people who are skilled in writing scripting, you're better using QPSMR. The reason you use MRDCL is, I guess, on sort of 2 or 3 different things. At each end of the spectrum is what I often say. So if something's very complex, MRDCL will do things that QPSMR can't do. And if QPS can do them, sometimes it's very tortuous, whereas in MRDCL that will be much less time to prepare it, provided the person knows how to do it. So there are things that in QPS that might take, let's say 4 hours to do, that you can do in about 15 minutes in MRDCL, provided you know how to do it. And at the other end of the spectrum, stuff that's really repetitive can be quite slow in QPS to do. So perhaps the sort of thing I'm thinking of, and I've seen people do that's quite laborious, is where perhaps you've got lots of rating statements and you want a top 2 box and a bottom 2 box. That sort of thing can be quite laborious in QPS to do, particularly if you've got lots of statements, whereas in MRDCL, that's pretty easy to do. And if you want a summary table of that, it's very easy to do. So there's a lot more tools available to do things that are complex or repetitive, which are the things that tend to take time as it happens. When it's just text, it makes no difference what you use, or barely makes any difference. And there's also some different types of survey, I think, where MRDCL is better. Again, if you've got the skills, things like tracking studies, diaries, multi-country studies, all those sorts of things can be quite time consuming to get each run out, or whatever it is you've got to do to match up data in tracking studies where questionnaires change. So it's not a simple question. It's a bit like the answer I gave to the first question, that if QPS does everything you do now and does it efficiently, it's probably a good solution. If you do a high throughput of work, or you're spending a lot of time doing some things, you might look at MRDCL to see whether it offers some shortcuts, and whether you want to invest that effort and staff in doing things in a scripting way. So it's not an easy answer. It's something, though, we like to advise on, and we'll give you honest answers on what we think will work for you based on your workload and what you're trying to do. So, sorry, very long answer to that. Sorry about that. Sorry, any more questions, Charlotte?
What volume of crosstabs do you need to handle to justify something like using MRDCL?
Okay, so this is obviously a specific question about one of our tabulation software packages, our scripting language, for those that aren't familiar with it. It can be a question of volume. It's not just a question of volume. I think it comes down to a number of things, and it's difficult to answer in a sort of 1 minute reply here. I think you need to have the right skills, and you need to make regular use, as I made the point just now, to use a scripting language. It's not something you're going to be able to pick up out of the box and start getting results on day one. But it might not just be volume, but I mean, typically people who use MRDCL are using it for most days of the week to get the most out of it, if not every day, but most days. And it takes time to get good at it, but once they get good at it, they'll get some real productivity benefits, and things that are complex in other bits of software suddenly become a lot easier. So it might be a question of volume. It might be just that you've got one person or a team of people, whatever it might be, enough work to keep them busy. But I wouldn't say it's just volume. The type of work, if you've got complex work or tracking studies or diaries, those sorts of things, a scripting language tends to handle those much more efficiently, but you do need the people to use them. So maybe that's one of those things that you want to talk to us afterwards about, your specific business, and I'll try to be more advisory on it then when I know a bit more about what you're trying to do.
Thanks for that. And we've got one here. You haven't made a comment about handling big data samples like 10,000 respondents. Does this affect your choice?
So, choice of software. I think, well, I can't answer for all bits of software out there because I don't know how effective they are. I can certainly say for our products, QPS and MRDCL, they have huge engines, but not just handle 10,000 records, I think is what the question asked, but handle hundreds of thousands, even millions of records. You're right. It's a good question to ask. Talking generally about software, the way that computers work is that when they get something that's too big for them, software packages don't just slow down, they slow down exponentially, or slow down in line with the volume. So an example that I have come across software products in market research where, let's say you run a survey of 10,000 people and it runs that in 5 minutes, you can't assume if it's 5 times the number of people, it'll run it in 25 minutes. Because the degradation can be exponential because of the way RAM works on computers and so on. So if you had big samples, my advice would be to check out with the software supplier that the sort of volumes that you want to run are not a problem for the software you intend to use. Certainly our products all handle those sorts of volumes easily. But it's something that you should check if you're going to use something that I don't know about or another product.
Thanks for that. We've got a couple more here. Is there any software that reports what is significantly different rather than producing hundreds of crosstabs?
That's a good question. I don't know of anything. I think most software now allows you to show significant differences on tables because it's something that's becoming more and more important or regularly used in market research, I think. I don't know of a tool that just extrapolates those figures that are significantly different and puts them into a report, say, rather than producing hundreds of tables. It's an interesting one. I have heard someone mention this before, and we're actually doing a lot of development in MRDCL next year. It's something that we could certainly consider putting into the software to add a sort of report on the main significant differences, so you get some sort of index that you can link to. It's an interesting idea. It's not something that I know anybody offers, except to show significant difference on tables. But having it in a report, I think, would be an interesting idea and something actually we could certainly consider. So I'm not sure I've got a good answer for that one, but it's a good point.
We've got one more that's come in here, and it is: our software handles tables well, but tracking studies are a problem. What would you suggest for this?
I think tracking studies are a problem for a lot of software packages anyway, and the sorts of things that cause a problem are what changes to the questionnaire, where questionnaires disappear and so on, changes to the brand list or code lists where an extra brand gets slotted in because there's a new brand on the market. Those sorts of things don't tend to get handled very well in a lot of software, because a lot of software doesn't cope with different versions of the questionnaire, where you want to sort of merge data together. I mean, you just need the right software that can handle tracking studies, and certainly tool MRDCL, for example. I ended up talking about our software a lot in this Q&A. I didn't intend to, but I am. Our tools handle tracking studies very, very well. I'll explain how they do it. MRDCL does it. You can either do it by recoding your data, which I think is a bad way to do it, but you can actually have a spreadsheet that just takes all the different versions of the questionnaire in a documented way, so that MRDCL can read that and pull all the data together, which is a very tidy way of doing it, because it makes it a sort of clerical task rather than a program task, which anybody can manage. QPS does it by handing data over to the next version, as it were. So you've done 5 weeks of a survey. When you get to the 6th week, if the questionnaire changes slightly, you can hand over the data into the format of the 6th week, and sort of keep everything currently up to date that way. And Snap has a similar technique as well, one of our other products, for sort of merging data into new formats, so that you get a master version as it is at the current stage. I think MRDCL does it best, in a sense, because it doesn't involve recoding, physically changing the data. But I think it's a good point. Most software out there doesn't handle tracking studies very well. I think our software is one of our strengths of our software. I did say I wasn't going to do sales in this session today, but I'm breaking my rule because I've been invited into it, I feel. It is a problem, tracking studies, because as we all know, clients say that tracking studies are never going to change, and then after 2 months of the survey, they add in some questions, they take some out, change the brand lists, add filters, and it gets more complicated than that. So a lot of software struggles with those sorts of scenarios, but I think we're very strong on that. So sorry to end on a sales note then, I said I wouldn't.
Great, well that's it for all the questions today. So I'll just round up the session then. So just to go into the rest of the week for Software Week, we've got tomorrow, Wednesday, it will be our reporting. On Thursday, we have our online communities and social media webinars. On Friday, we have a panel of experts discussing different market research conversations. So if you want to join any of those, you can still register for those. So hopefully we'll see you at those also. We also have blogs on our website that cover a lot of these topics, so please do visit that. And if you want any more information, any of the things that come up in this week or in topics, please give me an email and we'd be happy to give you more information and answer any questions that you have any further. So Phil, I don't know if you have anything to add, but from me, that's everything.
No, I think that's it for me. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Great, thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.